Greetings, fellow readers and story lovers, and welcome back to my channel. This video is the final installment of my three-part analysis of Act 2, Scene 2, the famous balcony scene, which you should all know by now because I've mentioned it in every single video I made on this scene so far. Right. No need to ramble on for too long. We all know the standard modus operandi by now. So let's dive straight back in with a little bit of a recap of the previous two videos. So in part one, I talked about the prologue of Act 2, how it informs the audience of what has happened, namely that Romeo has fallen in love with Juliet, and how dangerous that is for the two of them, while simultaneously reminding us that the play is a tragedy and that we shouldn't get too invested in the love story. This effect is strengthened by having the prologue be delivered by a chorus. The chorus functions as a voice of authority and subtly tells the audience how to interpret the events of the story, namely as a tragedy. And because of that, the audience becomes complicit in the tragic outcome. Can you tell that I find this bit important? I keep repeating it. We then move on to the first 9 lines of Act 2, Scene 2, where Romeo talks about his sexual desire for Juliet and compares her to the sun, which is quietly ironic because the night is their safety. By calling Juliet the sun, he inadvertently wishes away their protection from danger, setting up the same light and dark imagery that continues throughout the rest of the scene. And in last week's video, we talked about Romeo's idealization of Juliet. He compares her eyes to two of the fairest stars in all heaven and says that the brightness of her cheeks would shame those stars, which is quite obviously an exaggeration. Shakespeare uses the pretty common tradition of Petrarchan blazon, a technique where the physical attributes of a beloved woman are described in an over the top, almost impossible way. He then compares her to a bright angel and casts himself in the role of an admiring, worshipping mortal, which gives you a pretty good idea of how much he idealizes her in his head. Then Shakespeare shifts the focus of the scene, and we finally get to hear Juliet speak. She gives her very famous soliloquy in which she wonders why Romeo has to be Romeo and if his name really matters. We learn that she is a pretty practical and rational, downright philosophical character. She correctly identifies that their problem doesn't just lie in fate or in the stars, but in their social identities. They're trapped by being a Capulet and a Montague, which is what makes their love impossible. And she is willing to imagine a world where she could choose her identity rather than be born into it. And this is a pretty radical idea for a high standing woman in this time period, but it also highlights how fundamentally different Romeo and Juliet's approaches to love are. He idealizes and lifts love and desire into the heavens, and she's being practical about it and tries to reshape reality rather than escape it. And now, let's look at what happens when these two approaches finally meet, shall we? So, how does Romeo respond to Juliet's proposed solution, i.e., giving up their identities? He denounces his name 3 times, and Shakespeare makes sure we notice it. In lines 50 to 51, he says, "Call me but love, and I'll be new baptized. Henceforth I never will be Romeo." Then, in lines 54 to 56, in response to Juliet asking who he is, he says, "By a name I know not to tell thee who I am. My name, dear saint, is hateful to myself, because it is an enemy to thee." And then in line 61, after Juliet has recognized him by the sound of his voice and asked, "Hey, aren't you that Montague boy Romeo?" he says, "Neither, fair maid, if either thee dislike," which basically means something along the lines of, "I'm neither a Montague nor Romeo, if you don't want me to be either of those." So Immediately, we see that he is hook, line, and sinker for Juliet, complete and utter devotion. He is 100% willing to give up his name and his identity for her because he is so unequivocally in love with her, or, well, highly infatuated with her. Quick clarification: whenever I say that Romeo and Juliet are in love, I'm using that as shorthand. I mentioned in a previous video that you can interpret their feelings as genuine, as intense infatuation, or even just as teenage lust. And I'm not here to invalidate any of those. I'm just trying to make Shakespeare understandable. Okay? Okay, moving on. I also want to highlight that Romeo uses phrases like new baptized and calls Juliet his dear saint. Clearly, we're still using religious connotated language here, which further emphasizes how worshipful he is of her. He still doesn't view her as entirely human or entirely equal to him. He elevates her into something sacred, something to be worshipped rather than to be understood. From line 62 onward, their conversation turns into a rapid back and forth. So let me paraphrase what's happening. Juliet asks, "Hey, how did you get in here? The walls are too high to climb." And Romeo responds, "Love gave me wings so I could fly to you." And Juliet goes, "You know my family will murder you if they find you here." To which Romeo says, "I don't care, my love. I'd rather die tonight than be denied your love." And Juliet responds, "Whoa, dude, you must have a death wish." And then Romeo says, "Your love is all I need to keep me safe." Notice something here? I know I mostly paraphrase this part, and I will throw up some of the actual lines on the screen somewhere, but even in paraphrase, the difference between them becomes obvious. Juliet is far more practical than Romeo. She points out the real, actual danger that Romeo is in, and he responds with metaphor, with flowery, romantic language, saying things like, "Love gave me wings," or "Your love will keep me safe." He is blinded by the romance of it all. Or rather, he thinks that love is enough to keep them safe. Juliet, meanwhile, is fully aware of the danger that they're in should they be discovered. They're in the same garden, having the same conversation, but emotionally, they're not on the same page at all. Romeo is speaking in metaphors and grand romantic gestures, while Juliet is already asking a very different question. Is this love real? And if so, how can we sustain it? Which leads me nicely into the next part of the scene, where Juliet starts to negotiate the terms of her relationship with Romeo. So, Juliet starts this next part of the scene with a monologue. Now, why am I calling this one a monologue when I called her previous speech a soliloquy? Well, because, my fellow readers and story lovers, monologues and soliloquies are two different things. A monologue is when a character speaks uninterrupted for a longer stretch, usually to another character who is on stage with them. A soliloquy, however, is a very specific type of monologue. It reveals a character's innermost thoughts and feelings directly to the audience, and it typically happens when the character is alone, or at least when they think they are. So, at the beginning of the scene, Juliet thought she was alone and therefore wasn't talking to Romeo. She was talking to herself, and by extension, to us. Here's a fun thought experiment. If you were staging this scene, do you think Juliet would deliver that soliloquy directly to the audience? Like she's confiding in them? Or would she speak in a way that suggests she's truly alone, talking only to herself? I've seen soliloquies done both ways, and it often changes how intimate the moment feels. So I'm curious, how would you interpret this one? Anyways, back to the monologue, which Juliet is clearly directing at Romeo now. That's why it's a monologue and not a soliloquy. Here's what she says to him. Thou knowest the mask of night is on my face, as would a maiden blush bepaint my cheek for that which thou hast heard me speak tonight. Fain would I dwell on form, fain deny what I have spoke, but farewell compliment. Dost thou love me? I know you will say I, and I will take thy word, yet if thou swearst, thou mayst prove false. At lovers' perjuries they say Jove laughs. O gentle Romeo, if thou dost love, pronounce it faithfully. Or if thou think'st I am too quickly won, I'll frown and be perverse, and say thee nay, so thou wilt woo, but else not for the world. In truth, fair Montague, I am too fond, and therefore thou mayst think my behaviour light. But trust me, gentlemen, I'll prove more true than those that have more coying to be strange. I should have been more strange, I must confess, but that thou overheardst ere I was ware, my true love passion. Therefore pardon me, and not impute this yielding to light love, which the dark night hath so discovered. Now, I'm not going to go through this entire monologue line by line, but there are a few interesting things happening here. Essentially, Juliet does three things with this speech. She acknowledges that she spoke too freely because she didn't know Romeo was listening. She assures him that her feelings are genuine, even if she did reveal them too quickly. And she asks Romeo to confirm his love. When she tells him to pronounce it faithfully, she's basically saying, if you love me, say it, and mean it too. So this speech isn't just romantic, it's careful, protective, and deeply self aware in a way we haven't really seen from Romeo yet. He's the hopeless idealist, she's the realist. There are also some interesting details in her language, too. For example, she uses the word light twice. She worries that Romeo thinks her behavior is light, and later she asks him not to interpret her confession as light love. Now, in Shakespeare's time, light could mean unserious, but it could also mean morally loose or too easily won. In other words, Juliet is afraid Romeo might think she fell for him too quickly, or worse, that she could be conquered and abandoned, leaving her reputation destroyed. And just for context, this would have been a very big thing for a woman in this time period. So, beneath the romance, there's a very real social anxiety here. She's already thinking about the consequences their love could have for her. Another interesting moment is her reference to Jove, the highest god in Roman mythology, also sometimes called Jupiter, when she says that Jove laughs at lovers who swear false oaths. This works on two levels. For one, earlier in the scene, Romeo invoked Diana, another Roman deity, which shows that their symbolic language aligns. They think in similar metaphors. But Juliet's reference also carries a warning. Jove, or Zeus in Greek mythology, is famously unreliable in matters of love. If you know Greek mythology, you know that Zeus was, well, to be quite honest with you, he's a bit of a man whore. And in those stories, it was almost always the women who suffered the consequences. So, by invoking Jove, Juliet not so subtly questions Romeo's sincerity. Yes, she wants romance, but she also wants honesty. And finally, notice how she mentions night twice. At the beginning of her monologue, she says that the night acts like a mask, hiding her blush and protecting her embarrassment. But by the end of her speech, night has done the opposite. It has revealed her true feelings. So while darkness protects Romeo physically and allows him to be there safely, it has exposed Juliet emotionally. And that contrast tells us once again how different their perspectives are. Romeo lives in fantasy, while Juliet is already dealing with the reality of it all. Now, how does Romeo respond to all of this? Well, he does exactly what Juliet has asked him to. He tries to swear his love to her. And honestly, you can see where he's coming from. Juliet has just asked him to declare his love faithfully, so he immediately launches into a romantic vow. But almost as soon as he starts speaking, Juliet interrupts him. Now, the question is why? Well, because Romeo swears by the moon, and Juliet immediately rejects that idea, calling the moon inconstant and warning him not to swear by it, lest that thy love prove likewise variable. In other words, don't base your promises on something that constantly changes. Already, Juliet is pushing back against poetic exaggeration. She wants stability, not pretty imagery. So Romeo asks, understandably, what he should swear by instead. And Juliet goes, well, do not swear. Although I joy in thee, I have no joy of this contract tonight. It is too rash, too unadvised, too sudden, too like lightning which doth cease to be, ere one can say, it lightens. Once again, we see Juliet being remarkably rational and pragmatic. She isn't rejecting love, she's rejecting haste. You have to remember this entire situation would already have been socially unacceptable. A young noblewoman speaking privately with a man at night, even if he's just at her window and not even in her room, would have been scandalous. So Juliet is trying once again to protect herself from the very real social consequences this might have for her. What's interesting to me is that she compares their love to lightning. Earlier in the scene, Romeo describes Juliet as the sun, a symbol of permanence, warmth, and constancy. Now, Juliet introduces a different image, namely lightning, brief, sudden, and potentially destructive. And this contrast reveals a fundamental difference between them. Romeo believes that their love is eternal. Juliet is worried that it might burn brightly and then disappear. However, it's important to note that Juliet is not resisting the love itself. At this point, she has confessed her feelings for Romeo multiple times. She's not being coy about them. What she distrusts are empty words. Because for Juliet, love is not just emotional, it carries social and physical consequences. Giving herself to Romeo, emotionally and also potentially physically, could define the rest of her life. So she needs certainty. And that brings us to their next exchange, which I find to be one of the most fascinating moments in the scene. Juliet tries to end the conversation and say goodnight, but Romeo stops her and asks, oh, wilt thou leave me so unsatisfied? And Juliet immediately counters with, what satisfaction canst thou have tonight? Now, the word satisfaction carries a very clear sexual undertone. Essentially, Juliet is asking, what more do you want from me? That I give my virginity to you? Which the audience knows he does want. Remember, in the first 9 lines, he talked about that quite extensively. So Juliet is testing him. The question isn't naive, it's deliberate. And Romeo's answer is surprisingly pragmatic. He says, the exchange of thy love's faithful vow for mine. What he's saying is that he wants to marry Juliet. The faithful vow refers to wedding vows, a very binding commitment to Juliet. And with that, they have reached a compromise. Juliet gains security and social legitimacy. Romeo gains the possibility of a physical union, i.e., sex, but within the socially accepted framework of marriage, which protects Juliet from the fallout. Their love is no longer just poetry, it becomes a contract, a negotiation. And for the rest of the scene, they are both on the same page about what they want and are willing to give, which is permanence. And now we come to the final part of the scene. So, what happens after they've reached this moment of understanding? They get interrupted by the nurse who calls Juliet into her room. Not once, not twice, three separate times. And every time Juliet has to go inside and answer her, interrupting the flow of her and Romeo's conversation. As a result, they can only make their marriage plans, trying to organize a wedding for the very next day, in secret and in fragments. Their relationship is quite literally forced to exist in stolen moments, which makes their rush to get married almost understandable. Think about it. It's the only way they can be together openly without hiding and secrecy. So, what might seem impulsive and ill advised from the outside starts to make a strange amount of sense when you look at it from Romeo and Juliet's point of view. And I'd also like to point out again that they are literal teenagers. Of course, they don't come up with the most sensible plan. What plans did you come up with when you were their age? Because I didn't come up with very sensible ones. There's also a fascinating shift in imagery in this part of the scene. In lines 158 to 163, Romeo and Juliet suddenly start using the language of falconry, the medieval practice of hunting with trained birds of prey. Juliet calls out, "Hist, Romeo, hist!" a sound used to call back a hawk, and Romeo responds by calling her my niece, which is a term for a young hawk. And now that I look at the word and have said it out loud, I am not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I'm rolling with it. This seems to suggest that the bond between Romeo and Juliet is similar to the one between a bird and its falconer. However, I do find it interesting that Juliet is put in the position of the falconer and Romeo is put in the role of the bird. This suggests something interesting, namely that Juliet is the one who is in control. She calls him back and he responds. She sets the terms and he follows. Now, if we look at the dynamic they've had throughout this conversation, this makes complete sense. Juliet has consistently been the one calling the shots. She has defined the terms of their relationship by calling out Romeo's romanticized language and refusing to settle for anything less than legitimacy. She has been the one naming the risks to both Romeo and herself outright. And she is the one controlling her exit. The nurse might call her inside 3 times, but she comes back out every time until the very end of the scene when she decides to finally say goodnight to Romeo. In other words, she is in control of the situation, which I think is a particularly interesting choice Shakespeare has made here, to let the woman be the one who defines the relationship. But it's not domination. Falconry relies on trust rather than force. The bird returns because it chooses to, not because it's forced to. So Juliet's control is framed as gentle, mutual, and affectionate. And Romeo follows and trusts her willingly. After this, the tone briefly shifts again into something very romantic to the point of being almost cheesy. Juliet essentially says, "I forgot why I called you back." And Romeo responds, "Then I will stand here until you remember it." And Juliet replies, in effect, "Well, I'm not going to remember it if I keep looking at your stupidly beautiful face." It reminds me of the end of romantic phone calls in rom com movies, where the leads go, "No, you hang up. No, you hang up." It's surprisingly gentle and heartfelt. For a moment, they really are just a couple of teenagers being soppily in love with each other and who don't want to say goodbye just yet. And moments like these are important because they make the tragedy hit so much harder. Also, Shakespeare doesn't let the lightness last very long, because then Juliet introduces a different imagery to the scene. She says, "'Tis almost morning, I would have thee gone, and yet no farther than a wanton's bird that lets it hop a little from his hand, like a poor prisoner in his twisted gyves, and a silken thread plucks it back again, so loving jealous of his liberty." Here, she compares Romeo to a pet bird held by a child, allowed to hop a short distance away only to be pulled back by a string. On the surface, this image is tender. Juliet doesn't want Romeo to leave. But if we look a little more closely at the language, we see that the bird is described as a prisoner and it's held in gyves, which means shackles. Suddenly, the love that is meant to keep them safe starts to resemble confinement. It's a hint toward the coming tragedy. The love is meant to save them, but it's going to become their undoing. Eventually, though, morning approaches and they say goodbye for the final time. Juliet retreats into her room and Romeo is left alone on the stage. His final words are a promise that he will seek out Friar Lawrence and ask him to marry them. This moment is crucial. It turns the scene from fantasy into action, from imagination into planning. Their love is no longer just something they feel, but something they must act upon. And it changes everything. This also arguably turns the tragic outcome into something that they bring about by choice rather than by the workings of fate alone. They choose to act on their impulses. They choose to get married. They choose to go against their parents' wishes. So, while Act 1 shows the stars aligning and fate setting the tragedy in motion, in Act 2, it's Romeo and Juliet's choices that lock the tragedy into place. Right, we've made it to the end of another video. And with that, also to the end of another scene. Let's sum everything up, shall we? Act 2 opens with a prologue written in the form of a sonnet. This reminds the audience that while the romance is unfolding, the play is ultimately a tragedy and will not have a happy ending for our two main characters and lovers. It's also delivered by a chorus, which frames Romeo and Juliet's love as something predicted, something that is being controlled from the outside. It invites the audience to judge their romance even before they see it play out on stage, which to a certain extent makes the audience complicit in the tragic outcome. If Romeo and Juliet had just been allowed to be, maybe they'd have stood a chance. Scene 2 takes place in its entirety in the Capulet orchard. At first, Romeo is alone with his thoughts. He talks about his desire for Juliet, how he wants her to give her virginity to him. Then Juliet appears at the window and he launches into some waxing poetry about how she shines brighter than two of the fairest stars in all heaven. A pretty clear exaggeration meant to show how overwhelmed Romeo is by his feelings, but also how much he idealizes Juliet. This idealization continues when he switches from celestial to religious imagery. He calls Juliet a bright angel and casts himself in the role of the mortal, looking up reverently at the winged messenger of heaven that stands above him. So he lifts Juliet, and by extension his love for her, up into the heaven and away from the earthly plane, something that inadvertently shows us that their love cannot survive the cold, harsh reality that they're in. Juliet, on the other hand, is the opposite. She does not idealize love, but rather looks at it logically and pragmatically. We see this in her soliloquy, where she correctly identifies that her and Romeo's biggest obstacle lies not in the stars, but in who they are, in their names and their identities. Instead of escaping reality like Romeo tries to, she instead tries to reshape it, tries to imagine a world in which their names and social standings do not matter and in which they get to define their own identities. When Romeo and Juliet finally start talking to each other, their love stops being fantasy and idealization and becomes instead a negotiation. Juliet lays out pretty clearly what she wants and needs from Romeo: stability and permanence. She wants him to assure her of his love for her before she gives herself over to him. And Romeo rises to the challenge by offering to marry her. And at this precise moment, reality comes crashing in. Juliet gets called into her room by the nurse 3 times, which means that she and Romeo need to make their wedding plans in fragments and in secret. This lends an air of urgency and a certain degree of logic to their decision making. Marriage is the only way they can be together openly. So, while it may be rash, it also makes a certain amount of sense, at least when you look at it from a teenager's perspective. And as the scene moves toward its final goodbye, Shakespeare quietly reminds us where all of this is heading through the imagery that Juliet uses. She compares Romeo to a pet bird in a child's hand, only as free as the child allows it to be. She uses words like gyves, meaning shackles, and prisoner, language that seems rather striking after a scene so full of romantic poetry and imagined escapes from reality. In that moment, love begins to resemble confinement. The very thing that promised liberation from their families and identities already carries the suggestion that it will become their prison. The scene ends with Romeo declaring that he will go to Friar Lawrence in order to ask him to marry them, which turns the scene into plot. Their decisions have been made. From now on, Act 2 moves them inexorably closer to their wedding and the eventual tragedy. And that's it. That's all I have for you guys. Next time, we're going to start looking into Act 3, Scene 1, the moment where everything goes catastrophically wrong and the tragedy becomes truly inevitable. All because Mercutio can't keep his jabs to himself, Tybalt can't control his anger, and Romeo kind of gets caught in the crossfire. We're definitely going to look at that in the next few videos. For now, this is me signing off. Greetings, greetings, greetings. Falconry. Exchange of dialogues with his and constancy. Is that a word? It's probably a word. Fain would I. Clearly, I'm not an actor. In lines 158 to 100. I deliberately wrote out the numbers as words in my script because I know I will trip over them, and I still do. Julius. She's apparently a man now, and they are both gay, which is a story I would read. Thanks everyone for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like, share, and comment down below. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you don't want to miss any of my future videos. I also have a Patreon that you can subscribe to, starting at as little as $2 a month, which gives you early access to any of my videos. Higher tiers include access to exclusive Patreon-only content and the chance to suggest books, plays, or poems for any future analysis. For now, that is it from me, and I'll see you next time.